Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue on with our examination of the mid-20th century women's movement and also the counterculture revolution of the 1960s. So in our last lecture we looked at the rise of modern feminism. We examined the impact of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, and most notably the social grappling of the issue that was referred to as "quote unquote" the problem that has no name. We also saw the rise of female awareness, in which females across the Republic began to long for better employment opportunities. Those who had achieved college educations, who had achieved college degrees, they wanted to put those degrees to work. They wanted to earn a living as their male counterparts did. For women who had no real choice in working or not working, they wanted to also be able to rise and receive fair compensation. They wanted to rise in the employment structure where they were employed. And they also wanted to receive fair compensation for their time. They wanted there to be no gender-based distinctions in terms of pay or job opportunities. We also saw the advent of the word sexism during the late 1960s, and it was a play on racism has applied to gender. With that being said, after that quick brief recap, I'd like to dive right into our lecture. And we left off right after the discussion on sexism, and in particular what were they called? They were the consciousness raising workshops that the early feminists conducted to enlighten their fellow females to the fact that they were the victims of this insidious form of discrimination, so insidious that many of them had simply thought of it as a natural order of things. Women in consciousness groups often counseled one another on the need to avoid bad traditions of thinking, and particularly the bad tradition of thinking of each other as rivals for the affection of men. They call for solidarity rooted in sisterhood. They denounced conventional forms of female displays such as beauty contests, and the group known as WITCH, WITCH, picketed the Miss America pageant in 1968. One of their most attention-grabbing signs read, "Miss America sells it," which implicitly implies that the contest is a form of prostitution, and that by participating in this contest, all of the female contestants are, in effect, prostituting themselves. Their overall message was that women ought not to be evaluated on such frivolous merits as their appearance. The feminists controversially compared themselves to other ethnic minority groups, arguing that even though they were not a numerical minority or an ethnic minority like African Americans, they were nonetheless victims of systematic discrimination, and in that sense, they saw themselves as a minority group. They also understood the symbolism of public demonstration. They caught on very quickly from the teachings of groups and leaders such as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, who are experts at media operations, at publicity raising operations. These new groups, these new feminist groups, understood that, and they sought out to capitalize as well. Collective indignation, mass assembly, community support, and of course media publicity became all valuable tools or weapons in their arsenal. Now, on August 25th, 1970, the 50th anniversary of the women's suffrage in the Republic, the New York housewives went on strike, and a women's march for equality was held in New York City. Among the more radical feminist figures was Gloria Steinem. And Gloria Steinem was the founder of Ms. Magazine back in 1972, which was a reference, and Ms. was a reference to the dissatisfaction that a number of feminists had with men only having one designated title, whether they were married or not. A man is always, whether he's married or not, a man is always referred to as Mr., whereas women had separate titles. Miss if they were not married, and Mrs. if they were married. Ms. was the designation chosen to offer the same status to women that was afforded to men. That is, you can use Ms. whether you were married or unmarried. And there was a long-standing joke, at least a long-standing joke in the later part of the 20th century, in which you would ask a woman whether it was Mrs., Miss, or Ms. Sort of a tongue-in-cheek social commentary on all of that. Now, the name then applied to the journal produced for and by women. And Steinem herself had been a freelance journalist who had encountered what is referred to as the glass ceiling in journalism. She had wanted to cover really hard-edged political stories, but instead she would push towards what were, in her opinion, frivolous stories, the most noteworthy of which was an undercover expose on the life of and the working conditions of a Playboy bunny. That she had gone undercover, had the Playboy bunny, and written a pretty well articulated analysis of the life of a Playboy bunny. In an ironic twist, Steinem received a disproportionate amount of the feminist media attention because people found her conventionally attractive. She was very articulate, but she was also very striking to look at. And the other journalists simply gravitated towards her and prompted her up as the sort of spokesmouth, the spokeswoman for the feminist movement because they found her so attractive. Now, what developed was a pattern where the most prominent publications, the New York Times, Washington Post, all of the television networks, they would regularly ask Steinem for what became known as the women's view on pertinent issues. And this led to the development of a cult of personality around Steinem, which other feminist leaders grew to intensely dislike. For them, this was a duplication of the old order in which the quote-unquote beautiful woman was called and favored over all the others. Now, a minority of women began to view the world as a series of conflicts between men on one hand and women on the other. Susan Brown Miller wrote a book, Against Our Will, that was published in 1975. The book argues that the entire history of the world consists of a series of conflicts between men and women. The book also makes a very daring definition and evaluation of rape, arguing that rape is not a very horrible aberration of masculine-feminine relations, a crime committed by a very tiny minority, but that rape was argued, has the standard operating procedure by which men encountered women throughout history. She did admit that not all men were rapists, though she persisted that the men who do commit rape do so has an act to benefit all of men. Now, another dilemma that confronted the feminist community was lesbianism. Now, the idea was generated that if men were the enemy, the last thing you should be doing was consorting with the enemy. The question became, how do you do that? If you crave companionship and if you want long-term emotional support and stability, how do you find that if you're not going to find it with men? And the answer was through lesbianism. Many came to that conclusion, and a great debate raged then, and in some circles it still rages now in the feminist ranks regarding the normalcy of lesbianism, whether or not it represented a higher state of consciousness and being. Now, needless to say, this topic caused great conflict within the movement. Betty Friedan was a moderate feminist. She wanted slight changes for a particular group of women. Remember, her book, The Feminine Mystique, was an externalization of upper middle class and upper class women and their dissatisfaction with their life. There's a stifling restrictiveness of their lives. It was not written to mean that a poor girl who would most definitely have to mother and work to support herself and her family was not meant for her to say, well, I want better working conditions, I want a better life in general. Friedan's book was for a very narrow audience, and Friedan herself held very they were radical to our conservatives, but on the whole, her ideas were not that radical. She wasn't calling for a great realignment of the social order or anything. And this idea of lesbianism just completely alienated her and the majority of the moderate feminists. They took the view that all of this was nonsense. They thought that they would never be able, that they thought that the idea of attempting to persuade the vast majority of women that they ought to be lesbians was just a ridiculous notion. They stood firm on their decision and understanding that the majority of women would want to carry on relationships with men. They would want to continue relationships with men. Now, that being said, they were still hardliners for demanding equal pay for equal work. Now, the feminist movement coincided with the sexual revolution, another very prominent moment within this counterculture revolution. And the sexual revolution was a period in which the roles of men and women were much scrutinized in the Republic, and in the national understanding of the Republic. Now, in 1948, Kinsey, the famous Dr. Kinsey, released his report on male sexuality. And in 1953, Kinsey released another report, the Kinsey Report on female sexuality, and they found very high levels of premarital sex among both groups. They also found high levels of extramarital sex and homosexuality among both men and women. And this indicated that there was a lot more sexual activity going on than previously thought. In 1953, Hugh Hefner published the first edition of Playboy magazine, and in the early days, and I think they still do promote a very hedonistic philosophy regarding sex. The idea that sex was something that was recreational and entertaining and not something solely confined to marriage or for procreation purposes was radical in the coming out of the conformity and the straight-laced social ideas of the 1950s, of the early 1950s. You have to imagine that it was quite a shock for people attempting to roll back to high morals and to sort of impose a Leave It to Beaver type of morality and a Leave It to Beaver type of social conformity upon the Republic, to have Hugh Hefner come out with this with his Playboy magazine. Now, in 1962, Helen Gurley Brown would sort of up the ante in during the sexual revolution, and she did so by publishing the book "Sex and the Single Girl," a book of advice primarily addressed to young women on how they need not on how they need to get careers of their own, how they need to establish their own independence, and how they can get ahead in their careers and their lives without being propped up by a man. Now, the book also included a very frank admission that these women may have sex lives independent of marriage, and it caused a great controversy. Not so much because it was seen as sort of like destroying the moral fabric of the republic by advising these girls to shun early motherhood, to shun early marriage and early motherhood, and to strike out and to try to have careers of their own. But also the fact that it told them that this would happen and that it wasn't the end of the world if it did happen. It was controversial, to say the least. Now, Girly Brown later became the editor of another successful publication directed towards women, Cosmopolitan Magazine. And Cosmopolitan Magazine was one of the first publications that pioneered having nude male centerfolds as sort of the mirror image of Playboy magazine. Now, the sexual revolution had been aided a great deal by the perfection and the distribution of the contraceptive pill in the early 60s. This was a medical technology that really made it possible to reliably separate sex from procreation en masse for the first time since the extinction of silphium during the Roman Empire. During the 1960s, there was also a great concern regarding the overpopulation of the world. So the widespread use of the pill became linked to a long-term population management scheme and really came to be seen as a benign method of controlling the birth rate. Now, in 1968, the Roman Catholic Church went into convulsions when Pope Paul VI issued a proclamation upholding the church's ban on the use of contraceptives. The Pope articulated that to have sex was a gift from God, and to have sex in which your intention was not to procreate was an insult to God. Most of the contemporary Catholics, particularly in the United States, had expected the Pope to issue a statement endorsing the pill and endorsing oral contraceptives. Now, during this time frame, the social taboo on cohabitating, that is men and women living together outside of marriage and having children outside of marriage, broke down, and it broke down very rapidly. So what would have been regarded with absolute horror in the 1950s was quickly becoming the norm by the late 1960s. Even more dramatic was the changing of the legal and social views of abortion, which was permitted in the 1973 Supreme Court case of Roe v. Wade, a subject we will discuss in a later lecture. Now, the original anti-abortion laws had been passed in the late 19th century at a time when Roman Catholic still had a very strong prohibition against abortion. The Roman Catholic and the Catholic Church in general had a very strong prohibition against abortion back in the 19th century. Now, the Protestant churches had not really commented on it. The Protestant churches in the United States had not really commented on this issue. Most of the lobbying effort for these early abortion laws came from Protestant groups, however. They began to solidify and to really sort of stamp out regional law permitting abortion because they were afraid that the Roman Catholics were going to outstrip them in the national birth rate. The issue was that the Catholics were having lots of kids and that the Protestant birth rate was just falling too low. So in an act of anti-Catholic prejudice, anti-abortion laws were placed on the books. In another ironic twist, it would be the Roman Catholics who led the vanguard against abortion. And this came about as the result of all the reasons that we have been looking at. Now, we'll break here, and we will come back and we will complete our discussion on the women's movement and the other counterculture revolution movements. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. I am Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture, for the continuation of our discussion, really.